Steve McMichael, one of the greatest warriors American football has ever produced. The man who lit a fire for an entire city of Chicago for more than a decade. From a kid called Garbage Man by his friends in the remote town of Freer, Texas, he rose to become the symbol of the greatest defense in NFL history. With near superhuman strength and unstoppable will, he turned those early mornings collecting trash in South Texas into a journey to the pinnacle of the sport the entire United States worships. For more than a decade, he defined what real strength in football meant, not by speed or technique, but by an absolute, undeniable presence on every inch of the field. Steve McMichael, the legendary number 76 of the Chicago Bears, the soul of the unbeatable 46 defense, the man who helped create the most brutal Super Bowl victory in history. With a 46-10 win in Super Bowl 20, the player who appeared in 191 consecutive games without missing a single one, a record no one in the Bears franchise has broken, and the man whom coach Mike Ditka described with 4 words that needed no further explanation: the toughest I ever coached. But behind that legacy is a story not found in any stat sheet, not in any highlight reel, not in any Hall of Fame ceremony. A hidden battlefield of nameless pain, of things taken away one by one in a way no tackle on earth could prepare you for, of tragedies that a Super Bowl ring could not protect against and the Hall of Fame could not soothe. The world cheered his name for many years, but very few were willing to face the haunting truth he carried. In silence, in the darkness, in those final days when the cheers had long faded and all that remained was the steady sound of a breathing machine in a small room in Homer Glen, Illinois. Before we begin, if number 76 ever made your heart beat faster during those Chicago winters, if the 1985 season was ever part of your memories, if the name Mongo ever made you smile, please leave a like as a tribute to the man who gave everything he had, even the things he didn't know he was giving. Freer, Texas was not a town of dreams. It was a town of people who once had dreams, then learned to keep living without them. Located between Laredo and Corpus Christi, so arid that even weeds struggled to take root, Freer was a place where oil and poverty existed side by side. And in most of the homes there, poverty always won. This is where Steve McMichael grew up. Not grew up in the gentle sense of childhood, but grew up in the sense that children had to learn to be tough before they learned to dream. Because in Freer, dreaming was a luxury few families could afford. Steve was born in Houston in 1957, but his parents separated before he turned 2. The name McMichael that the whole country would later know, the name engraved in the Hall of Fame, the name that 73,000 fans in the Superdome would cheer on Super Bowl night, was not actually his biological father's last name. It was the surname of E.V. McMichael, his stepfather, whom his mother remarried later and whom Steve accepted as his father and took as his own last name. From the very first days of his life, Steve McMichael was someone who built himself from the pieces others had left behind. And that was the first, most painful, and perhaps most important lesson life taught him before he was old enough to understand what it meant. Mornings in Freer started before the sun. Before the Texas sun could scorch the ground, before the other kids had even woken up, Steve was already following his stepfather onto the truck to collect trash around town. Not because he wanted to, not because anyone forced him in a harsh way, but because the family needed extra money, because E.V. needed extra hands, and because Steve, a child who grew up faster in the way only deprived children do, understood that without anyone having to sit down and explain it. He just woke up, got on the truck, and did what needed to be done. That was dignity Freer style, quiet, unseen, unpraised. But his classmates saw it. They saw it in the worst possible way. The way of children who had not yet learned kindness, who had not yet understood that their words could stick into others like shards of glass and never be fully removed. They saw the kid with trash bags in his hands, on the garbage truck, in clothes that carried the smell of a job no one wanted to do, and they gave him a nickname: Garbage Man, Trash Boy. Not once for fun and then done, not for a week and then bored, but every day, for years, repeated with the cruel patience of children who didn't know what they were doing. Until those words were no longer just nicknames. They became a voice inside Steve McMichael's head, whispering in his weakest moments, his darkest nights, the moments when even the strongest man didn't have enough armor to block it out. You're just the garbage man's kid. You'll never be anything more than that. Freer didn't teach people to dream. Freer taught people to survive. Steve's entire graduating class had only 54 people. Small enough that everyone knew everything about each other. Small enough that there was nowhere to hide. Small enough that nicknames followed you from one class to the next, without anyone needing to remind them. The town's only annual cultural festival was rattlesnake hunting, and Steve learned how to hunt venomous snakes from a young age, not out of curiosity, not for fun, but because in Freer, you learned to stand in front of dangerous things and not run, or they would come for you first. That was the philosophy of a town with no room for the fearful. And Steve McMichael absorbed that philosophy into his bones long before he knew how to read. The football field was the only place where the voice fell silent. When the ball was in play, when a tackle hit, when the whistle blew, and teammates cheered, no one looked at his background. No one remembered the morning trash runs. No one heard the nickname. On the football field, Steve McMichael was just Steve McMichael. And that was the only thing in his life that he could control completely. The only thing that could not be taken away by a cruel word from the neighbor kid. Every tackle was an answer to every time he was called garbage man. Every victory was proof of what the whole town of Freer refused to believe, that the kid on the garbage truck could become something, could become someone. In his senior year of high school, Steve played 6 sports at the same time: football, basketball, baseball, track, tennis, golf. His favorite was baseball. Batting .450, noticed by the St. Louis Cardinals and Cincinnati Reds, people saying he could have a future there. But football gave him something baseball could not: physical collision, where pain and victory were not two separate things but one, where everything he had swallowed during all those years in Freer could be given back in a way the world called sports. But for Steve McMichael felt closer to liberation than anything else. The boy in Freer, Texas, learned the first lesson of life earlier than most people: that the world does not naturally give you dignity, that you have to seize it inch by inch, tackle by tackle, with sweat and blood and early mornings while others were still sleeping. And even after earning it, even after the Super Bowl ring was on his hand and the whole country knew his name, there were still nights when the old voice came back whispering in the darkness, "You're just the garbage man's kid." Steve McMichael fought that voice his whole life, and perhaps, in a way that only those who have carried similar wounds can understand. That was also why he never stopped, never enough, never allowed himself to rest, because resting meant the voice would be heard. But before football could carry Steve McMichael out of Freer, life taught him another lesson, heavier, darker, and one no tackle on earth could prepare him for: EV. McMichael was not Steve's biological father, but in every definition of a father a child could need, Evie was all of that. Not in the way of fathers in movies, not with emotional speeches or carefully arranged hugs. Evie showed love in the way of Freer men. Through presence, through never letting Steve feel like a burden, no matter how hard life was, through standing on the sidelines for every football game without missing one, whether it was sunny or rainy, no matter how tired his work made him. He didn't say, "I'm proud of you," in the literal sense of the words, but he was there. And for a child who grew up without his biological father, sometimes presence spoke louder than any words. When it came time to choose a college, Steve McMichael received scholarship offers from 75 schools. 75. Bear Bryant of Alabama wanted him to play tight end. Darrell Royal of Texas wanted him as a defensive end. The whole country was fighting over a kid from Freer who not long before had been called Garbage Man. And Steve, who could have chosen anywhere, who could have gone as far as possible from the town that hadn't believed in him, chose the University of Texas. Not because it had the best football program, not because of the highest scholarship, but because Texas was a place where Steve McMichael could drive to watch his son play ball. Because the son wanted his stepfather to see him become something. Wanted to stand on the field knowing the man who had believed in him was sitting somewhere in the stands. That was love in Steve McMichael's way, not spoken, but shown through a decision that changed the entire course of his life. Then his freshman year of college came, and with it, something no lesson in Freer had prepared him for. E.V. McMichael was shot by a disgruntled former employee. The bullet did not end him immediately, as if fate wanted to prolong the pain for a few more days for those who loved him. The heart attack in the days that followed was what took him. Steve was in Austin when he received the news, hundreds of miles from Freer, and there is no distance on earth more painful than the distance between where you are standing and where the person you love is leaving. When you cannot make it back in time, there is no way to prepare for that moment, no matter who you are, no matter how strong you are. E.V. McMichael passed away without ever seeing Steve become an All-American, without ever seeing his son's name called in the NFL draft, without ever seeing number 76 run out onto Soldier Field amid the cheers of Chicago, without ever seeing the Super Bowl ring, without ever sitting in the stands in Canton, Ohio on Hall of Fame Day, the day the whole country finally said what E.V. had known from those early mornings in Freer when no one else believed, that this son deserved to be remembered. The man who had bet the most on Steve McMichael did not get to see any of the results of that bet, not a single one. And that was an injustice no championship ring in the world could compensate for, no title could soothe, no Super Bowl night could fill. E.V.'s death did not make Steve McMichael collapse in the way people usually understand collapse. It did not stop him. It did not make him weaken in a way visible from the outside. It did something crueler. It turned pain into fuel, loss into something darker and more intense and unstoppable. Steve started playing football like a man seeking revenge for someone he could not name. In his senior season at Texas, he was a consensus first-team All-American. The team's defense allowed under 9 points per game, a nearly unthinkable number. Those closest to him in those years knew every tackle was not just football. Every tackle was a conversation that had never been finished, a thank you that had never been said, I did it, Dad, that he no longer had anyone to say it to. Decades later, when the Super Bowl ring was on his hand, when the name Mongo had entered American football history, when all of Chicago had come to love him in a way Freer, Texas never had, Steve McMichael still carried that question. Would Dad be proud? Would Dad see this? No one could answer that question for him. Not teammates, not coaches, not cheering crowds. It was a kind of loneliness no stadium was big enough to fill, no applause loud enough to drown out. The kind of loneliness that exists only in the space between what you have achieved and the person you wanted to see you achieve it. And perhaps this is the cruelest paradox of Steve McMichael's entire story. Something only clear when looking back from the end of the journey. The man who didn't get to say thank you to his father before his father passed eventually left in a similar way. ALS would take Steve McMichael's voice before it took everything else. And the man who didn't get to say, I love you, Dad, to E.V. would in turn leave without being able to say goodbye to Misty, without being able to say Dad loves you to Macy, without being able to say thank you to those who stood by him through the darkest days. History, sometimes, repeats itself in ways no one wants to recognize. E.V. McMichael never knew that the son he believed in, the kid on the garbage truck, the kid called Garbage Man, would become the man the whole country mentioned when talking about the greatest defense in NFL history. And Steve McMichael never got to look his father in the eyes and say the words his whole life playing football had been meant to prove. I did it because of you. That was a void no Hall of Fame could fill, no Super Bowl ring could compensate for, no cheers from 73,000 fans could soothe. And it was there, in the silence after every victory, in the darkness after every night of glory, in every tackle of the man trying to defeat something strength could not touch, until the final day of his life. But before all those losses could be transformed into something else, life gave Steve McMichael a rare moment he had never tasted before. The moment of being truly recognized for who he really was. January of 1979, Aloha Stadium, Hawaii. The Hula Bowl, the most prestigious all-star game in American college football, where the best players of an entire season gathered to play one last time before entering the NFL. Dozens of scouts sat in the stands with clipboards and binoculars, noting every tackle, every step, every reaction, searching for something not everyone had. And on that night, on the grass of Hawaii, under the white lights of the stadium, Steve McMichael showed them exactly what they were looking for. He was voted the defensive MVP of the game. For the first time in Steve McMichael's life, he was not the kid who had to prove anything, not the person who had to fight to be seen, not garbage man or trash boy or any nickname freer. Texas had stuck on him. For the first time, he was the one the entire room paid attention to, not because they wanted to hurt him, but because they could not look away. That feeling, being recognized, being properly valued, the world saying, "We see you, and you are good enough," was what Steve McMichael had hungered for since those early mornings following EV, on trash runs, since the years sitting in classrooms where no one remembered his name, from all the moments life told him he was not enough. And in one short night in Hawaii, he tasted it, long enough to know he wanted it, short enough to understand it could be taken away at any time. Fate, with Steve McMichael, never let him enjoy it for too long. The 1980 NFL Draft came with all the promises the Hula Bowl had created. Scouts had written positive reports. Experts had placed his name on first-round candidate lists. 75 colleges had once fought over him, and now people said the NFL would fight over him in the same way. Steve McMichael sat in front of the TV screen on draft day next to his family and waited. Waited for his name to be called. Waited for the moment when all the years in Freer, all the morning trash runs, all the tackles and seasons and the pain named EV would be transformed into a name announced to the whole country. But before that, there was a knee surgery. And a knee surgery, even a minor one, even one that had healed well, was enough to change how the men in NFL draft rooms looked at a name. No one said it outright. No one called him to explain. The franchises simply stayed silent. And in the world of the NFL draft, silence had its own language. Pick 1 passed. Pick 10. Pick 20. Pick 50. Steve McMichael sat and counted. No longer with excitement, but with something heavier and more familiar, the feeling he had known from sitting in classrooms in Freer where no one called his name, from all the times the world looked past him as if he weren't there. Pick 72, then 73. The New England Patriots called Steve McMichael's name. Third round. For most people, a third-round NFL draft pick is something to celebrate. Proof that you are good enough to be selected, that the road ahead is opening. But for Steve McMichael, the man who had spent his whole life proving he was not the below-average kid Freer had labeled him, who had played football partly for EV, and partly because he needed to prove that garbage men could become someone. Third round was the most familiar and terrifying signal he knew. The signal that the voice inside his head had said throughout the years in Freer. The world still thinks you're not good enough. He was used to that feeling, but being used to it didn't mean it didn't hurt. And there was one other thing on that draft day that Steve McMichael could not yet know, something that only many decades later, sitting in the room in Homer Glen with a breathing machine beside him, he could look back on and see clearly. The knee surgery that year, that was the first time his body betrayed him. The first time in his life, the only thing he had always been able to control completely, his body, told him it had limits, that it could be damaged, that not every battle could be won by will alone. He didn't know that then. He only knew that he would prove the third round was their mistake, not his limit. And he would spend his entire career doing exactly that. But the body remembers what the mind refuses to acknowledge. And the bill, for Steve McMichael, would be presented later, in a way no one could predict on that 1980 draft day. On the night of the 1980 NFL draft, Steve McMichael sat and waited for his name to be called, while 72 other players were chosen before him. Each pick was one more time the world said, "Not you yet." He had grown used to that feeling from Freer, from classrooms where no one remembered his name, from all the years standing on the edge, waiting to be seen. Used to it didn't mean it didn't hurt. And hurt, for Steve McMichael, never meant stopping. Never, until something stronger than his will forced him to stop. And that he had not yet met. Not yet. The 1980 New England Patriots were not the place for Steve McMichael. But Steve McMichael didn't know that when he walked in. He arrived with all the energy of a man with something to prove. And with Steve McMichael, that was always everything. Freever, Texas, the garbage man nickname. EV, never getting to see. Third round draft when first round was expected. All of that piled up inside him like pressure in a sealed container with no release valve. And when he stepped onto the Patriots' practice field, that pressure escaped in the only way Steve McMichael knew, by playing as if every practice was the last game of his life. The Patriots in 1980 were not an environment for that kind of energy. They wanted control. Control by the definition of men sitting in air-conditioned offices, not the definition of a kid who grew up in a town whose only cultural festival was rattlesnake hunting. They wanted discipline neatly packaged in pre-written rules, and Steve McMichael had never learned how to fit into anyone else's mold, because Freer didn't teach that. Freer taught you to survive. Freer taught you to stand firm in front of dangerous things. Freer didn't teach you how to please people sitting in meeting rooms worried about the franchise's image. He practiced in a way that made teammates unsure if it was practice or real war. He explored Boston at night in a way that Patriots management called a problem, even though for Steve it was just how he existed, big, loud, unapologetic for anything. He was not a bad person. He had never been a bad person. He was just someone not made to fit into other people's molds. And the Patriots, in 1980, had no room for people like that. After 6 games, the Patriots made their decision. Not at the end of the season. Not after giving him a real chance to prove himself. 6 games, enough for them to conclude, not enough for him to rebut. And they said it straight, in the way Steve would later recount with a smile in interviews, at Bears events, in front of audiences, who would laugh along because the story was told well. "Steve, we think you're a criminal element in this league. Get out." People hear that and laugh, because Steve told it in a way that made them laugh. But few stopped long enough to ask, that night, when the Patriots' office door closed behind him, when Steve McMichael held the contract termination paper in his hand and stood alone, what did he think? He thought about Freer, about the early mornings following EV on trash runs and the laughter of his classmates from behind his back, about the garbage man nickname that had never completely disappeared, only buried under tackles and winning seasons, about EV, who had passed without seeing his son wear an NFL uniform, and now the son no longer had an NFL uniform either, about 6 games, only 6 games, that a franchise had used to tell him he didn't belong here, that he wasn't enough, that everything he had built from Freer to Texas to the Hula Bowl wasn't enough to keep him there after he had sacrificed everything to get there. This was not the first time the world had told Steve McMichael he didn't belong here, but the previous times, at least, he had been a kid. Now he was a man. And the pain of a man had no tears to let out, no one to run home to, no football field to hide in that night. There was no guarantee the Bears would call. There was no guarantee of a second chance in the NFL, because the NFL did not have a habit of giving people called a criminal element another chance. Steve McMichael was in the space between what had been lost and what was still unclear. And that was the most painful kind of space a person could live in. Not because it was dark, but because it was unclear. Clear failure at least had a shape to confront. But not knowing if you still had a chance, that was the kind of waiting that wore a person down from the inside without leaving a visible wound. In 1981, the Chicago Bears called, signed him as a free agent, not because they saw a future legend, not because they read anything special in his 6 games with the Patriots, but because Buddy Ryan, the defensive coordinator with an unusual eye for football and for people, saw in Steve McMichael what the Patriots had looked at and called a problem: uncontrollable energy, aggression with no limits, a will that refused to obey the boundaries others set. The Patriots saw danger. Buddy Ryan saw a weapon, if placed in the right spot. But even when he arrived with the Bears, Steve McMichael was not welcomed like a returning winner. He was a free agent, an outsider, with the mark of being cut, following him like an inescapable shadow. He had to prove it practice by practice, game by game, that the Patriots had been wrong and the Bears had been right to bet on him. No one built a bridge for him across that gap. He had to swim himself, in the literal sense of the word, in an environment where if he didn't save himself, no one would. And then Mike Ditka called him into the office, looked him straight in the eyes, and said the words that in more than 20 years of professional career, no one had ever said to Steve McMichael. "I hear you're a dirty player in practice. Don't change. Don't change." Those 3 words, for the man who had been told his whole life that he needed to change to fit other people's molds, that he was too much, that he was in the wrong place, that he was a criminal element in a league with no room for people like him. Those 3 words carried the weight of all the years of rejection combined. Ditka was the first in his professional career to look at Steve McMichael and not see a problem that needed fixing. He saw the man standing in front of him, exactly as he was. And for someone who had been told his whole life that he himself was not enough, that was the sentence that changed everything. There are falls that people don't write about because they are not dramatic enough to be headlines, not public enough to be stories, not clear enough for outsiders to look at and call tragedies. The night Steve McMichael was cut by the Patriots had no one taking pictures, no one interviewing, no breaking news or highlight reel. Just one man, one piece of paper, and all the voices from freer Texas returning once more to whisper what they had whispered through all the long years. "See, that's all you are." And Steve McMichael had to stand up by himself, with no audience, no spotlight, no one watching. Only the will of someone who had learned to stand up before he knew how to fall. That was what Freer had taught him. And that was something no one, not the Patriots, not any franchise, could take away. And then, slowly, day by day, in those practices at Hallis Hall, Steve McMichael began to become what Buddy Ryan had seen in him from the start. Not an immediate explosion, not one defining moment, but the slow accumulation of a man finally finding the ground where he belonged, and rooting himself there with all the strength of someone who knew he had nowhere else to go. 1985 came like something people only understand when looking back. Because while living in it, it didn't feel like history. It felt like football, like every Sunday. Like pain and tape and locker rooms and Buddy Ryan drawing diagrams on the board and Mike Singletary looking at him in a way that needed no words. 15 wins, 1 loss. Buddy Ryan's 46 defense, something the entire NFL had never seen and didn't know how to handle. Mike Singletary was the soul, Richard Dent was the spear, Dan Hampton was the wall, and Steve McMichael, the one no one thought of first when mentioning the team's name, the one who was not the brightest star on a team full of stars, was the foundation, the thing that kept it all standing when pressure came from every side. People don't think about the foundation when looking at a building. They only think about it when it collapses. And the foundation of the 1985 Bears did not collapse. Not once, not in any game, not on any Sunday throughout that long season. But the people in the locker room saw what the cameras never captured. Steve McMichael played the 1985 season with cracked ribs. Not bruised ribs, cracked, with a knee wrapped so heavily that those who didn't know would think it was a pre-game ritual, not a medical necessity. with a shoulder that had absorbed impacts that sports doctors today, with all the advances of science and modern injury protocols, would immediately place him on the injured list and not allow him on the field. But this was not today. This was 1985, and in the NFL culture of the 1980s, especially in the culture of the Bears under Mike Ditka, the man who once played with a broken arm without telling anyone, rest had only one meaning: weakness. Steve McMichael did not rest, not because he didn't know pain. He knew pain very well. Pain in the way people only know when their bodies have absorbed enough impacts that they can no longer distinguish old pain from new pain, all blended into one stable foundation he learned to live with and not think about. He didn't rest because he could not let anyone call him weak. Not after everything he had gone through to stand here. Freer, EV, the Patriots, the termination paper, and the whispering voices in the night. Not after all of that and then stop because of cracked ribs. 191 consecutive games without missing a single one. People recount that number like a miracle, and it was a miracle. There is no denying that. But 191 games also meant 191 Sundays that Steve McMichael's body endured impacts at speeds and forces the human brain was not built to absorb, that the spinal cord was not designed to withstand, that the nerve cells were not programmed to fully recover after each week. 191 times Steve McMichael told his body, "Shut up, keep going." And the body obeyed, because it had no other choice when the will controlling it was that strong. But the body also remembered. The body did not forget. And eventually, in a way no one in the Hallas Hall locker room in the winter of 1985 could imagine, the body would present the bill for those 191 Sundays. In the cruelest way possible. In a way no Super Bowl ring could pay. But the night of January 26, 1986 was not yet the time to know that. The Superdome in New Orleans, 46-10. The most one-sided victory in Super Bowl history up to that point. Not because the Bears were lucky, not because the Patriots played poorly, but because the 46 defense on that night was the closest thing to perfection American football had ever witnessed. Steve McMichael recorded a sack in the Super Bowl. The championship ring finally rested on the hand of the man who had once been called Garbage Man in Freer, Texas. The man the Patriots had called a criminal element and cut after 6 games, the man who had to swim alone across the gap between failure and opportunity with no one building a bridge. That kid stood at the pinnacle of American football that night. And amid all the noise, amid all the lights, amid all the cheers of 73,000 fans and millions watching on TV across the United States, there was a silence that only Steve McMichael knew. A silence shaped like a man who was not there. E.V. McMichael was not there, not sitting in the stands, not standing in the hallway waiting, not present to see the son he had stood on the sidelines, watching play on the small fields of Freer. Now standing on the biggest field in American football, with a championship ring on his hand. The greatest victory of Steve McMichael's life came with the deepest pain, that the person he wanted to share it with most was no longer there to receive it. And there was no way to patch that void, no matter how valuable the ring, no matter how loud the cheers. After the Super Bowl, Steve McMichael returned to Chicago a hero in the full and true sense of the word. But heroes also have sleepless nights. Heroes also have moments standing in front of the mirror in a hotel bathroom after all the parties and celebrations have died down. And seeing the Freer kid looking back from the mirror's surface, asking the question with no ending, "Is it enough yet? Have you proven enough yet?" And the answer, no matter how many victories, no matter the ring on his hand, was always no, because the person he wanted to prove it to was no longer there to see. And no score, no ring, no night of glory could fill the void shaped like E.V. McMichael in Steve's life. After losses, rare in his career, but they existed. Steve McMichael stayed in the locker room after most of his teammates had left. Sat alone in front of his locker in his dirty uniform, dried blood on the white pants, ice bags on his knee, staring down at the floor in a way that outsiders would think he was thinking about strategy, about what had gone wrong in the game. But that wasn't it. He sat with the full weight of failure. Not the weight of football, but the weight of all the times the world had told him he wasn't good enough, all the times the voices from freer returned, all the things a loss pulled up from beneath the layers of victories he had built to bury them. For Steve McMichael, losing was never just about the score. It was every time the world reminded him that he was not allowed to rest, not allowed to let up, not allowed to believe the voice had been silenced forever. And for someone who grew up hearing that voice every day, losing always hurt in a more personal and private way than any outsider could understand. Super Bowl 20 was recorded in history as the greatest victory of the Chicago Bears, perhaps of the entire decade of American football. But in the Superdome locker room that night, there was a man sitting with a championship ring on his hand and crying, not out of happiness, though happiness was there too, but out of missing a person who could not be there, missing the early mornings in Freer before the sun rose, the garbage truck and trash bags, and the laughter of children who didn't understand what they were doing, missing all the things that had to be paid, not with money or sweat, but with things that had no price like knees and ribs and the nerve cells in the brain that absorbed 191 Sundays of impacts and never fully recovered. Glory and pain for Steve McMichael never came separately. They came together, intertwined so deeply they could not be separated, like light and darkness in the same room, like cheers and silence in the same night. But even in that greatest night of glory, even when the ring had just been placed on his hand, and the cheers of the Superdome still echoed in his ears, there was something Steve McMichael was building that he didn't know he was building. Something that would follow him off the football field, out of WCW, out of all the spotlight lights life had given him, and eventually become the heaviest thing he had ever carried. The nickname Mongo came from the character in the comedy movie Blazing Saddles, the giant, aggressive, fearless guy who knocked a horse down with one punch and didn't understand why people thought that was unusual. Teammates gave him the name and Steve embraced it, because Mongo fit him in a way few nicknames fit the person they were given to. Big, loud, unapologetic for anything, pulling out a switchblade to clean his teeth on live television when asked about strategy against opponents, sharpening a hunting knife in the locker room while reporters came for interviews, smashing his helmet into his own face in the locker room before a game, licking the blood running down his cheek and yelling, "That's right, boys, I'm ready," while teammates looked at each other with the expressions of people who had gotten used to this but still weren't completely used to it. Mongo was a performance, and Steve McMichael was the most talented actor in the role of himself. But the thing few asked, the thing even those closest to him rarely stopped to think about, was what the price was of having to be Mongo every day for decades. Every time he appeared in public, people waited. They waited for the bigness, the loudness, the funny stories, the booming laughter. They waited for Mongo, not Steve McMichael, but the character they had decided he was before he even opened his mouth. And Steve, who had learned to read what others needed from him before he learned to read words, who had survived in Freer by understanding what people needed to see from him, never disappointed the audience. He gave them Mongo every time, no exceptions. But a performance is never free. It consumes something from inside each time it is performed. Something small, not enough to notice in a day or a week, but accumulated over many years, over thousands of times being Mongo in front of others, that became a large debt that Steve McMichael didn't know he was borrowing. Mike Singletary, who had stood beside Steve in the Bears' most glorious years, who understood him in the way only those who shared the same trenches could, once said something few paid enough attention to. Steve is much smarter and deeper than the image he created, but he chose to hide it, because that's how the world wanted to see him. That was not a completely free choice. It was the adaptation of someone who grew up knowing the world did not love complexity. The world loved familiar and easily digestible things, characters that could be summed up in one nickname and an image that needed no further explanation. Leslie Frazier, teammate who later became an NFL coach, told of the times reading the Bible with Steve during and after their playing days. He knew the Bible deeper than anyone on the team. Knew it in the way of someone who read not to quote, but to understand. But he didn't want anyone to know that. A man who had to hide the truest part of himself, not out of shame, but because that part didn't fit the character the world had decided he was. That was not freedom. That was a kind of prison more subtle than any prison with walls and bars, because its walls were built from the inside and no one saw them except the person living in it. After big wins, when teammates celebrated, when beer flowed, when laughter filled the locker room, and everyone hugged and the world felt simple and good in the way only victory could create. Steve McMichael was the one who came and went, present but not completely there. No one really asked him, "Are you okay? Are you really okay?" Because that question was not for Mongo. Mongo was always okay. Mongo was the one who made others okay, who lifted the whole room when energy was low, whose presence meant everything was good. No one thought to ask if the person pulling everyone up needed someone to pull him up. But there were nights coming home, after all the noise, after all the performance, after the door closed and there was no one left to be Mongo in front of. Steve sat in silence and didn't know what he felt, because all day he had felt what others wanted him to feel, had been what others wanted him to be, and after all of that ended, there was not enough quiet space left to ask himself, what do you really want? Who are you really? Each season, Steve McMichael's body absorbed more, impact upon impact, injury upon injury. He didn't just accept the Bears' culture, no room for weakness, no room for rest. No room for saying, "I'm in too much pain, I need to stop." He represented that culture. He was the one who embodied it most clearly. The one who, when looked at, the whole team knew there was no reason to complain, because the man with cracked ribs was still going out on the field. Every time he played through pain was one more time the body recorded damage that was never fully healed. The impacts accumulated in the brain in a way that 1980s sports science did not understand and did not measure. The nerve cells endured, then recovered, then endured again, but never returned to the starting point. And many decades after those seasons, the things that had accumulated would present the bill in a way Steve McMichael could not refuse, could not negotiate, could not punch through with will. After leaving the NFL, Steve became a full and true Chicago figure, on sports radio, at Bears events, in the collective memory of a city that loved football like it loved air to breathe. The name Mongo never faded. People recognized him on the street. People wanted photos, wanted to hear stories, wanted to be near the man who was part of the most legendary thing their city had ever produced. But being famous in Chicago did not mean being understood in Chicago. People knew Mongo. No one knew Steve, the man who read the Bible in quiet, who sat alone in front of his locker after losses and carried the weight of fear, who had a question that was never answered about the father who didn't get to see him succeed. There was a heartbreaking paradox at the center of Steve McMichael's life that no one saw until it was too late. When he lay in bed in Homer Glen and could no longer be Mongo, even if he wanted. The more people knew his name, the less chance he had to be himself. Mongo was the shield he built to survive, first in Freer against the kids who called him Garbage Man, then in the NFL against a system that wanted him to fit a mold, then in WCW against audiences wanting drama, then in Chicago against a city wanting a legend. That shield had done its job. It had protected him through all of that, but a shield strong enough to protect you was also heavy enough to bend your back over time. And Steve McMichael carried that weight his whole life, in silence, in nights no one saw, in the space between who he had been in front of the world and who he really was when the door closed, and in the emptiness that Mongo left behind every night when the door closed. There was a woman who had once been the answer. Or at least, that was what Steve McMichael believed for 13 years. Steve's mother met Deborah Marshall on a flight. One of those chance encounters people often call destiny because there is no other way to explain it. The two women sat next to each other on the plane, started talking in the way strangers sometimes do when there is nothing else to do. And the mother saw something in the young woman in front of her that made her think of her son. Not because Deborah was perfect or because she could see the future, but because the mother knew her son, knew that behind all the noise of Mongo, behind all the performances and nicknames and stadium lights, there was a man who needed someone by his side in a way that teammates and fans and the entire city of Chicago could not fill. She arranged a blind date, and from that date, a relationship formed, not through the NFL spotlight or the showbiz stage, but in the most normal, private, and real way possible for two people finding each other. In 1985, the same year as the Super Bowl, the same year as the championship ring, the same year Steve McMichael stood at the pinnacle of American football, they got married. There was something both beautiful and painful in that coincidence, even though no one saw the painful part at the time. The two of them stepped into each other's lives at the highest point of a journey, and no one knew that from the peak, the only direction possible was down. 13 years. Through the peak glory of the NFL, through winning and losing seasons, through the transition to WCW, when the grass field was no longer Steve's battlefield, but instead the wrestling ring with pre-written scripts and predetermined outcomes. 13 years was long enough for people to believe this was something that would last. Long enough to stop asking if it would last and start taking it for granted that it would. Deborah followed Steve into WCW, stood beside him on the wrestling stage as his companion, valet in the language of that world. To the public, they were a powerful couple, the big aggressive man and the woman by his side who knew how to draw the audience's attention. WCW knew how to use both of them, and for a while, everything seemed like it still was everything. But WCW had its storylines. Stories written by people who knew that conflict sold tickets better than harmony, that betrayal created better drama than loyalty. And when those people started building conflict between Steve and Jeff Jarrett, when the script started demanding that Deborah stand with Jarrett, the line between what happened on the stage and what happened in real life began to blur in ways no one had planned in advance. Or perhaps, and this was something those who knew Steve only said in silence, never publicly, that line had already blurred before the script demanded it. Bash at the Beach, July of 1997. The match for the WCW United States Championship. The night that in front of millions of viewers, Deborah McMichael handed the steel briefcase to Jeff Jarrett, and Jarrett used it to knock out her husband. Steve fell to the mat. The crowd roared. It was entertainment. It was what they paid to see. But those who knew Steve knew that some things that night were not scripted. Not all of it. There was no way to know exactly where the line was. No way to look inside a marriage from the outside and see clearly. But enough for those closest to him to sense that when Steve McMichael fell to the mat that night, something outside the script fell with him. On October 12, 1998, the divorce papers were signed. No public scandal, no war in the press. No strong statements and mutual accusations in the way the public sometimes expects when a celebrity marriage ends. Just silence, and the end of 13 years in that silence, in the way Steve McMichael handled most of the most painful things in his life. Alone, without needing anyone to know, without letting anyone see the wound. Steve McMichael never commented publicly about his previous marriage. Not a single statement, not a word of criticism. Not a single sentence in all the years on Chicago radio, in all the interviews and fan events and conversations with supporters. Not one sentence about Deborah, about WCW, about the night at Bash at the Beach, or the divorce papers in October of 1998. The man who could stand in front of cameras and talk about cracked ribs and taped knees and the most painful losses of his career could not talk about this. because there are wounds that even Mongo had no language to face publicly, wounds that did not have the shape of sports injuries, no clear address to point to and say, "Here, this is where I was hurt." That silence, to those who understood him, said more than any statement could. The man no one could knock down on the NFL field, the man who played through cracked ribs and taped knees without mentioning it once, was hurt the deepest by the person who stood beside him in the same year he stood at the peak of American football. The Super Bowl ring and the divorce papers. The same person, the same journey, the same year that began both. Fate with Steve McMichael was never simple. It never gave him one thing without taking another. It never let him stand at the peak without something eroding from below. After the divorce papers were signed, Steve McMichael was alone for a period he never told anyone how long it lasted. There was no one to come home with after public appearances. No one on the other side of the dinner table. The biggest man in the room, the smallest when no one was looking. And in that emptiness, in the silent nights of the house, with no other voice, questions no football game could answer, began to ask themselves louder than usual. Who am I when there is no spotlight? What am I when there is no team? What is left of me when you take away everything that defined me in front of others? There is a special kind of loneliness for those used to living in crowds. When the crowd disappears. Steve McMichael had lived his whole life with tens of thousands cheering his name, with locker rooms full of teammates, with Chicago always recognizing him on the street. And after the night the divorce papers were signed, he sat in the silent house and faced the question that no Super Bowl ring, no Hall of Fame, no legendary nickname could answer. Who is Steve McMichael when no one is looking? That question would stay with him until another woman stepped in. Not through the spotlight, not through a script, but in the most normal and real way, two people find each other. And this time, unlike every time before, Steve McMichael would not have to be Mongo to be loved. Misty Davenport entered Steve McMichael's life, not through the spotlight, not through the stage, not through anything related to football or wrestling or all the noisy worlds he had lived in. She came after all of that had receded, when the emptiness in the silent house was still there, when the question of who Steve McMichael was when no one was looking still had no answer. And the most special thing about Misty, the thing Steve would later understand was more precious than anything he had ever had, was that she did not know Mongo. She did not know the man who threw a chair through the chalkboard before the Super Bowl. She did not know the WCW wrestler. She did not know the character Chicago loved and the whole country recognized on the street. She only knew Steve, the man who laughed loudly but had nights he could not sleep. The man who told great stories but sometimes sat in silence, in a way no one around him understood why. The man who carried something from Freer, Texas that no city, no team, no championship ring had ever completely taken away. On March 24th, 2001, they got married. And for the first time in a very long time, perhaps the first time in his life in the truest sense, Steve McMichael had someone to come home to without needing to be anyone other than himself. On January 22, 2008, at Northwestern Memorial's Prentice Women's Hospital, at 4:12 in the afternoon, Macy Dale McMichael was born. 6 pounds 2 ounces. And Steve McMichael, the 270-pound man who had once crushed NFL quarterbacks bigger than most normal people, who played through cracked ribs without mentioning it, who did not know fear by any definition of the word, stood in the delivery room, and for the first time in his life, did not know where to put his hands. The hands that had caused so much pain to so many people on so many Sundays, now handed a tiny, fragile life, so light that he feared his own strength, completely dependent on the person holding her in a way no football or wrestling script had prepared him for. And Steve McMichael cried. Not out of weakness, not out of anything people usually use the word weakness to describe, but because there are moments in life when even the strongest person has no defense. And that moment was one of them. The boy from Freer, Texas, the man no one could knock down, standing in the delivery room and crying over a tiny life named Macy. In the first few years, the McMichael family had something Steve had never fully had in his life: normalcy. Not normalcy in the sense of ordinary or boring, but normalcy in the most beautiful sense of the word. Breakfast with Misty, Macy's laughter in the house. Afternoons when he did not need to be anyone except the father, Steve McMichael, the man who had lived his whole life on the stages of football and wrestling and Chicago radio, discovered that life in rooms without spotlights could also be full in a way spotlights never brought. Then Macy was not yet 4 years old, and the doctor said the word leukemia. Steve McMichael's world shrank to a single point in that moment. No more NFL, no more Super Bowl ring, no more Hall of Fame or legacy or anything he had built and fought and bled for. Only his 4-year-old daughter and the blood cancer attacking her small body, and the question no tackle on earth could answer, no will could push back. Why my child? The days in the hospital, Steve McMichael sat by Macy's bed and looked at things he had no language to handle. The tubes attached to her small body, the machines beeping steadily to the rhythm of his daughter's heartbeat, the bags of chemicals flowing slowly into her veins in the way doctors explained was necessary but looked cruel to any father watching. The man who had never known fear sat there and could do nothing, could not block the disease, could not stand between Macy and leukemia the way he stood between a quarterback and the end zone, could not tackle it, could not play through the pain this time because the one in pain was not him. And that was the cruelest thing, the thing Steve McMichael had never had to face in all the years of enduring cracked ribs and taped knees. Someone else's pain, the pain of the person he loved most, that he could not absorb in their place, no matter how much he wanted to. That was the cruelest kind of helplessness a man could experience. And Steve McMichael, who had built his entire life on the foundation of strength and control, and never letting anything defeat him, had to sit in it with no way out. While Steve struggled with that, Misty was the one who kept everything from collapsing. She scheduled the chemotherapy, asked the doctors the right questions, sat with Macy through the long nights no child should have to endure. And after Macy fell asleep, after Steve had left or dozed off in the chair beside the bed, Misty sat in the hospital hallway and cried alone. Not because she was weaker than Steve, but because she understood that in this family, at this time, someone had to be strong for everyone. And she chose to be that person, even though no one asked, even though no one knew what it cost her every night in the hospital hallway. After many months of chemotherapy, Macy McMichael beat leukemia. The 4-year-old did what her father could not do for her. She stood up on her own and defeated the enemy in the only way possible, by enduring things that could not be endured, and still being here after they passed. Steve looked at his daughter and saw something he recognized. Not from the football field or from WCW or from any place with spotlight lights. He recognized it from Freer, Texas. From the early mornings and the nicknames and the voices whispering that he would never be anything more than that. Macy beat leukemia in the way Steve McMichael had beaten Freer, by continuing when there was no clear reason to continue, except the fact that giving up was not an option. But while Macy was fighting cancer, while the family's entire focus was on their daughter and the bags of chemicals and the hospital days, Steve McMichael began to notice unusual things with his own body. Muscles weakening in ways that could not be explained by age or old injuries. Difficulty moving in places that should not be difficult. Small, scattered signals, not clear enough to be anything, or clear enough to be something he did not want to acknowledge. He pushed them aside, because Macy needed him focused, because it was not the time, because, and this was the truest reason no one said out loud, because part of Steve McMichael knew that if he looked straight at those signals, he would see something all his strength could not punch through. Fate with the McMichaels was not cruel once and done. It was cruel continuously, patiently, not giving people enough time to breathe, to think everything was okay. While Macy was recovering from cancer, Steve was stepping into the beginning of something he did not yet have a name for. 2 battles, the same family, so close together that if it were not real life, people would think it was a script written by someone wanting to prove that human limits have no end. Macy grew up knowing she once had cancer, and grew up watching her father, the biggest, strongest, most fearless man she knew, begin to change in ways a child had no language to describe but enough love to recognize. She grew up understanding illness and loss earlier than any child should, and Steve McMichael had no way to protect her from that, even though he had protected her from so many other things. Steve McMichael fought 300-pound linemen without his hands shaking. But when sitting by Macy's hospital bed during chemotherapy days, those hands shook. Not out of weakness, not out of lack of courage, but because this was the only thing in Steve McMichael's entire life that could not be fought with strength, could not be played through with will, could not be stood up and tackled down. Love, it turned out, was the thing that made the strongest person the most vulnerable. Because when you love someone deeply enough, their pain becomes your pain that you cannot absorb in their place. And Steve McMichael, who never allowed himself to be vulnerable, who had built his whole life on the foundation of never letting anyone see him shake, had no choice but to shake, and love and fear, and keep sitting there beside his daughter through the longest days of his life. The signals had started earlier, from the days when Macy was still recovering, from the mornings when Steve noticed something was wrong but chose not to look at it. He had pushed them aside because Macy needed him focused. But the body does not wait until the time is convenient. The body does not read the family's schedule and decide to back off until things are better. The body just speaks. And Steve McMichael, who had learned to read every signal of his body through 191 Sundays on the NFL field, knew that what he was hearing was not the voice of age or old injuries. It was something else. Something he did not have a name for, but knew was terrifying in a way cracked ribs and taped knees had never been terrifying. ALS did not come like a tackle. There was no moment of impact, no sound of collision, no clear point you could point to and say, "Here, this is where everything changed." It came like water slowly seeping into a wall. So slowly you did not notice until the wall had been wet for a long time. So slowly the line between before and after became blurred and impossible to define. Muscles weakening in strange ways. Fingers not gripping as tightly as before. Not weak in the sense of old age or tiredness, but weak in the sense that something inside was slowly stopping, taking orders. Walking had something unfamiliar. A small imbalance, not enough for others to notice, but enough for Steve McMichael, who had lived in this body through thousands of hours of training and games, to feel immediately that something was wrong. In September of 2020, a neurologist at the Mayo Clinic said the word ALS for the first time. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, a name carrying a whole history of great people taken away in this way. The disease that destroys motor neurons, the cells that control every voluntary movement of the body, from lifting a hand to swallowing food to breathing. No cure, no exceptions for anyone. Average life expectancy after diagnosis, 2 to 5 years. Steve listened to the doctor speak. Then he sat silent. No one knew what he was thinking in that moment. No one sat close enough to see clearly what was happening behind the eyes of the man who had just heard his sentence. Because Steve McMichael had spent his whole life not letting anyone see him defeated. From Freer, from the Patriots, from all the things that had tried to define him by failure or limits or not being good enough, he had never let anything see him collapse. And he was not starting now. Not in the Mayo Clinic exam room, not in front of the doctor with the clipboard and words with no good answers. In January of 2021, doctors in Chicago confirmed it. No more doubt. No room for hope that the Mayo Clinic had been wrong, that this was something less cruel, that with enough will and enough persistence, it could be tackled down like everything else in his life. The sentence was read a second time, clearer, more certain, with no words that could be understood any other way. Steve came home, sat down beside Misty, and for the first time in many decades, the man who once needed no one, who had built his whole life on the foundation of self-reliance and not letting the world see he needed someone to sit beside him. Just sit beside him. No need to say anything. Just to be there in the silent space between the sentence that had just been read and the life that had to continue whether that sentence existed or not. On April 23, 2021, Steve announced it to the world, no hiding, not because he wanted pity from the public. Steve McMichael and pity had never existed in the same sentence, but because he had never been someone who ran from the hardest things. He did not run from childhood in Freer. He did not run from the night the Patriots cut him. He did not run from the divorce papers, and he would not run from this, especially this, the disease that no will could defeat but could still be faced with dignity. Chicago's reaction was shock, the kind of shock with no sound, the kind where people sat with their phones in hand and read the news 3 times because the brain refused to process it the first time. Because no one in the city that loved Steve McMichael the way Chicago loved him thought this could happen to Mongo. Legends do not get ALS. The immortals in a city's collective memory do not get an incurable disease. And when reality intruded into that collective imagination, it hurt in a way no loss in Bears history, no failure on the field could cause. Then ALS began doing its job, not in a hurry, not loudly, with the cruel patience of something that knew it would win and did not need to rush. First came the ability to raise his arms above his head, something Steve McMichael had done millions of times in millions of practices, something his body had done without thinking since he was a child in Freer. Then the ability to grip tightly, the hands that had once tackled hundreds of quarterbacks in 191 Sundays, the hands that had once held Macy on the day she was born, the hands that had signed contracts and divorce papers and everything in between, now could not hold a glass of water without shaking. Then the ability to stand up without support, then walking, then feeding himself, one by one, in order at a pace just fast enough for Steve to be aware of each loss before the next loss came. And then, the most painful thing, the thing those who knew Steve all said, was the thing they could not imagine happening to this particular man, his voice. No one knows exactly which day Steve McMichael spoke his last complete sentence. It was something ALS did not announce in advance, no schedule, no warning, no chance to prepare a goodbye to his own voice. One day he spoke. The next day his voice was a little weaker, in a way that if you were not paying close attention you might think it was tiredness or a cold. Then weaker still. Then only a whisper, the voice of the man who had once made the entire Bears locker room shake with his laughter, who had told stories on Chicago radio for years to the point people recognized his voice before his name, shrinking into a whisper, then only lips moving, then silence. There was no farewell ceremony with his voice. No final prepared speech, no carefully chosen words to be the conclusion of everything he had said throughout his life. Just one day he spoke, and the next day he could not speak any more. And the world Steve McMichael had used words to dominate his whole life became a world he observed in silence. Dan Hampton, his closest teammate, who had drunk Crown Royal with him on the team plane after wins, who had stood by him through glorious seasons and nights after losses, sat by Steve's bed and tried to accept what could not be accepted. He is still completely aware, Hampton said, in the way of someone trying to explain something language was not created to explain. Still understands everything, still has all those thoughts, memories, feelings, but cannot express them. Trapped inside. For someone like Steve, who spent his life using physical presence and voice to dominate space, I have no words to describe it. And this is the truth few stop to face, the truth that sports science and NFL franchises, and all those who love American football must sit with, and are not allowed to look away from. Research shows NFL players have a 4 times higher risk of ALS than normal people. 4 times. 191 games of impacts. 191 Sundays, a body absorbed forces at speeds and levels the human brain was not built to absorb continuously for 13 years. Those tackles created the legend of Steve McMichael. They made him Mongo, made him the Bears' Iron Man, made him the man Mike Ditka called the toughest he ever coached. And those tackles, in a way no one in the Halas Hall locker room in the 1980s could know, in a way even the science of that time did not understand, were also slowly destroying something inside his brain that no one saw until it was too late to do anything differently. America loves football. America loves the tackles and the stars and the legends created from strength and will. America loves Mongo. And Steve McMichael gave all of that, not knowing the price would not be collected right on the field, not collected in the form of treatable injuries or healable ribs. The price would be collected later, in the room in Homer Glen, Illinois, by something no Super Bowl ring could pay, and no Hall of Fame could compensate for. ALS does not read career stats. It does not care about 191 consecutive games, or Super Bowl 20, or the Hall of Fame, or all the things Steve McMichael had built from the early mornings in Freer to the night at the Superdome in New Orleans. It just came, quietly, patiently, cruelly, and began dismantling the man who once thought himself invincible, one piece at a time, without hurry, as if it had all the time in the world, while Steve McMichael did not. And Steve McMichael, for the first time in his entire life, for the first time since the trash-collecting mornings in Freer, when he decided nothing would defeat him, had no way to respond except to endure, and continue, and love those around him with everything he had left, and then life continued. Not in the sense of those movies where the character finds new strength and rises above adversity with light shining from behind, but in the truest and cruelest sense of the word. Waking up every morning, living each day in a body that was gradually no longer obeying, going to sleep each night, knowing tomorrow something else would be taken away. In the first months after diagnosis, 2021, then 2022, the things taken away were still small enough that Steve McMichael had to pay attention to notice them. But when he paid attention, he saw them clearly. Needing help to stand up from a chair, needing someone to help put on a shirt in the morning, a movement he had done alone since he was a child in Freer with no help, needing Misty beside him to use the bathroom, to bathe, to do all the things normal people do without thinking because they are so obvious, so automatic, so much a part of existing that people never stop to be grateful for the ability to do them. For most people, that dependence would be an inconvenience. Painful, yes, but something people learn to adapt to. For Steve McMichael, who had built his whole life on the foundation of needing no one, of standing up by himself from everything that had tried to defeat him, of being the strongest man in the room, not because of muscles, but because he never let anyone see him need. That dependence was the loss of something more core than physical strength. It was the loss of definition, the loss of the answer to the question of who I am that he had built over his entire life. And every day another piece of that answer disappeared. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and surely like the tide going out. Misty McMichael was not trained to do what she was doing. There was no medical school, no caregiving course that prepared a woman for the moment she had to become nurse, caregiver, protector, interpreter of eye language. All at once, for the man she loved, every day with no days off and no clear ending, except an ending no one wanted to think about. She learned how to operate the breathing machine, learned how to change tubes, learned how to schedule medications by the times and dosages that a doctor would need many years of training to understand, learned how to explain to Macy, in a way appropriate for her age, in a way that did not take away more of her remaining childhood than the disease already had, why Dad was becoming quieter, why Dad could no longer hug her, why the most normal things in family life were gradually no longer normal. And through all of that, Misty was not allowed to collapse in front of Steve, not because anyone forbade it, but because she understood in the way of someone who had loved someone long enough to know what they needed without it being said. That Steve McMichael needed to see her strong, not because he was weak, but because in all the things ALS had taken, the last thing still keeping him the person he had been, dignity, will, The way he faced things that could not be changed depended partly on him not having to see the person he loved most collapse because of him. So Misty held herself together every day, in front of Steve, in front of Macy, in front of everyone who came to visit. And what she did after Steve fell asleep, what happened in the silence of the house after everyone had left, and there was no one left who needed to see her strong. No one knew. That was the most invisible sacrifice in this story. The sacrifice with no name and no audience, and not recorded in any page of football history. In August of 2023, Steve McMichael became completely bedridden in the house in Homer Glen, Illinois. No more wheelchair. No more afternoons sitting in the living room. Just the bed, wrapped in Chicago Bears navy and orange sheets, the colors of the franchise he had given 13 years and 92.5 sacks and 191 Sundays without missing a single one. On the room walls were unchanging photos. Steve at the Super Bowl, the victory smile and championship ring. Steve with Ric Flair, two men who had lived lives bigger than most could imagine. Steve with Macy, the daughter who had once beaten leukemia and was now learning to live in the shadow of another disease. He could not turn his head to look at those photos, could not move to look left or right, could not call Misty's name when he needed her, could not tell Macy Dad loves you when she came into the room after school, could not say I'm in pain or I'm cold or any of the countless things people say to each other every day without realizing it is a privilege. The privilege of having a voice, of having a body that obeys, of being in control of one's own life. Only his eyes. And Misty learned to read those eyes like language, a language with no dictionary, no textbook, no one to teach it, only learned through more than 20 years of loving and knowing and paying attention to each other in the way only people who truly love each other pay attention. What the teammates who came to visit could not accept was not the physical decline, not the image of the big aggressive man now lying motionless, but the opposite of everything they saw from the outside. Steve McMichael was still completely aware inside. ALS took the body, but it did not take the mind. When teammates came and told old stories, he listened and understood and wanted to laugh the way he had laughed in the Bears locker room 30 years earlier, but his facial muscles had no way to respond. When Macy walked into the room and talked about her school day, about friends, about the small things in the life of a 17-year-old, he listened and wanted to ask more, wanted to know more, wanted to be the father participating in the story instead of just the listener. But there was no way, trapped inside his own body, completely aware, completely understanding, completely unable to do anything with all that awareness and understanding except keep it inside and continue listening and continue feeling in absolute silence. That was not just physical tragedy. For Steve McMichael, who had used physical presence and voice to dominate space his whole life, who himself was the noise and energy and filled every room he walked into, that was mental torture in the literal and most precise sense of the word. In the winter of 2023, one night that Misty would later never recount without pausing in the middle, an old nurse accidentally unplugged Steve's breathing machine. Misty found her husband turning purple. She immediately connected him to the portable ventilator. A few seconds, just a few more seconds, and the outcome of that night would have been completely different. Misty recounted it not like a hero, not like someone who had done something extraordinary, but like someone who had lived in fear every second and minute for years to the point reaction became instinct, to the point crisis became normal in a way no one should get used to, but some people have no other choice. Macy McMichael grew up in those years, from 13 to 17 years old, years when others worried about schoolwork and thought about friends and built their lives from the small pieces of adolescence. She learned to communicate with her father through his eyes, learned to read when he was happy, when he was in pain, when he wanted her to stay a little longer. There were afternoons she sat by the bed and told stories, not sure if Dad could hear, not sure if Dad understood everything, No way to confirm except the times his eyes lit up in the way Macy learned to recognize as a smile. And that was enough for her to stay. Enough for her to keep telling stories. The child who had once beaten leukemia, learning to love the father who could no longer say, "Dad loves you," with words. In early 2023, Steve and Misty signed the DNR. Do not resuscitate. No resuscitation. The decision made in the silence of the meeting room with the doctor. No cameras. No witnesses except the two who had chosen each other since 2001 and now had to make the heaviest decision of both their lives together. Heavier than any game. Heavier than any contract. Heavier than everything Steve McMichael had ever signed his name to in his career. Because this was not the signature of someone starting something. This was the signature of someone accepting something about how it would end. There is a kind of courage no one makes movies about, no one writes articles praising, with no cheering stands and no spotlight shining on it. That is the courage of waking up every morning in a body that is no longer your own, and still choosing to continue that day. Not because there is hope for a miracle, not because he believed ALS would back down before the will of the man who had played 191 consecutive games, but because giving up was not something Steve McMichael knew how to do. Not in Freer, not after the night the Patriots cut him, not after the divorce papers, not when sitting by Macy's hospital bed, and not now. Even when winning no longer meant anything in any ordinary definition of the word, he still continued, because that was the only way Steve McMichael knew how to live, and because Misty was still there, and because Macy still walked into the room every afternoon and told stories, and because sometimes, only sometimes, eye contact was still enough to say the things his voice could no longer say. And then the phone rang. Not Steve's phone. Steve had not been able to hold a phone for a long time. Misty's phone. One morning in August of 2023, in the house in Homer Glen, where every day began with the steady sound of the breathing machine and ended with the steady sound of the breathing machine, and everything in between was caregiving and waiting and not knowing what exactly they were waiting for, except the thing no one in the house said out loud. The Pro Football Hall of Fame announced that Steve McMichael was one of the 12 senior candidates for the class of 2024. Misty stood in the hallway of her house and did not go into Steve's room right away. She needed time, not much, just a few minutes, just enough to breathe and think and make a decision no one could make for her. Because this was not simple news to bring into the room of a man lying motionless in bed with a signed DNR. This was hope, and hope, for someone in Steve's condition, could be cruel in a way despair never was. Despair at least was honest. Hope could be broken. Steve had been nominated in 2014, not selected. Nominated again in 2015, not selected again. 2 times hope was built up and 2 times broken. In the silent and bureaucratic way of decisions made by a committee Steve had never met, in meeting rooms he was never allowed into, about his career by criteria he never fully understood. And now the 3rd time, when he could no longer speak, could no longer move, could do nothing except lie there and listen and look with the only eyes still his. Misty went into the room, held Steve's hand, the hand that could no longer grip back, could no longer squeeze in response to her, but was still his hand, still the one she had held through more than 20 years of everything they had gone through together. She looked into his eyes. "Honey," the Hall of Fame called. "Do you remember?" Steve's eyes changed, not in a way easy to describe or explain to someone who had not learned to read someone's eyes like the only remaining language between two people. But Misty had learned, through many months, through hundreds of mornings and afternoons and evenings, standing by the bed, watching and remembering and understanding the smallest shades no dictionary recorded. And she recognized it immediately. Something lit up, not hope in the naive sense, but recognition, the recognition of someone who had waited for this for a long time, and now heard its name mentioned and knew right away this was it, exactly it. "You've waited so long for this. If you get in, I want you to be here to see it." Misty paused. not because she did not know what to say next, but because the next sentence was the heaviest she had ever spoken in her life. Heavier than the marriage vows, heavier than anything she had said to anyone in any circumstance. She breathed and said, "Do you want me to tear up the DNR? Blink once for yes, twice for no." Silence. The breathing machine continued steadily, as if nothing was happening. Because for machines, nothing was happening. Only for the humans in that room was something happening, something bigger than any game, heavier than any decision Steve McMichael had ever had to make on or off the field. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. 3 seconds longer than any 3 seconds in Misty McMichael's life. Longer than all the nights listening to the breathing machine combined. Steve looked straight into his wife's eyes and blinked. Once, Misty tore up the DNR, called the ambulance, and did what they had decided not to do. Because there was one reason, one single reason, but heavy enough to reverse the decision made in the meeting room with the doctor and words with no good answers. But the body does not wait for anyone to have a good reason. On the way to Silver Cross Hospital, Steve's body went into sepsis, blood infection, something doctors called one of the most serious developments possible for an ALS patient. He fell into a coma. The ambulance raced away with the man who had just chosen to live longer to wait for the Hall of Fame, dying on the stretcher. He almost died, Misty recounted later, in the way of someone talking about something that happened to someone else, because that was the only way to tell it without breaking in the middle. When you get sepsis, people usually don't recover, but he did. The next morning, Steve woke up. No one could count how many times in Steve McMichael's life he had woken up from something that should have ended him. From NFL games his body should not have endured, from the night the Patriots cut him, and all the voices from Freer returning. From the night the nurse accidentally unplugged the breathing machine. But he woke up, because he had the Hall of Fame to wait for. And for Steve McMichael, one reason was still a reason, even if it was only one. The months after that were the months Misty would later call the hardest. Not because Steve was weaker, though he was weaker, but because they were living in the space between hope and not knowing, waiting for the call from the Hall of Fame, while every day was still every day of ALS, of the breathing machine and tubes and eyes as the only remaining language. There was one infection in the fall that made the whole house hold its breath for several days. There were anxious tube changes, and then near Christmas. Once again, Misty had to use the portable ventilator to keep her husband in this world a little longer. On January 24th, 2024, Misty's phone rang again. A gray day in Homer Glen, the kind of gray of an Illinois winter that people who did not grow up there cannot fully understand, the kind of gray that seeps into everything and makes the world seem smaller and heavier than it is. FaceTime. Richard Dent on the screen, the Gold Hall of Fame jacket on him, the smile of someone about to say something good and knowing it. Misty screamed. Not a scream of joy, in the way of someone receiving good news in normal conditions, but a scream in the way of someone who had held all the pressure, all the fear, all the nights lying listening to the breathing machine, and wondering if tonight was the last night, holding all of that in for many months, and now could not hold it anymore, and no longer needed to. She ran into Steve's room, pressed her head beside him on the bed, beside the man who could not hug her back, could not turn to look at her, but could hear and could understand everything. She held up the phone. "I have the privilege of announcing that you have been elected to the class of 2024. Steve's eyes moved back and forth on the screen, following Dent, following the smile, following the gold jacket, following everything that sentence meant. Then, with all the strength left in a body that had almost completely stopped functioning, with an effort that anyone looking would clearly see as effort, not natural, not easy, he strained to lift his face up and bared his teeth in a smile. Steve McMichael's smile, the smile the whole of Chicago had recognized, the smile of the man unapologetic for anything, the smile of the Freer kid who had proven everyone wrong about him. appeared once more on the face of the man lying in the bed in Homer Glen, Illinois. Misty cried. Not light crying in the way of someone moved by something beautiful, but the crying of someone who had held back tears for too long because there had never been a time to cry, no space to cry, and now finally, she could cry for something that was not fear or pain or loss, but for something Steve McMichael had deserved long before any committee was willing to admit it. On August 3rd, 2024, the Hall of Fame came to Homer Glen. Not Steve going to Canton, because Steve could not go to Canton, could not get on a plane, could not sit on the stage in front of thousands, and receive the gold jacket in the way he had imagined during the years of waiting. So the Hall of Fame came to him, in a way few organizations do and few people receive. Steve lay in bed in the gold jacket, the gold of the Hall of Fame on the body of the man who had worn Chicago Bears navy and orange for 13 years. Around the bed, Misty holding his hand. Macy standing beside her mother, 16 years old and having understood more than any 16-year-old should. Mike Singletary, who had sat beside Steve through glorious seasons and losses and everything in between. Jimbo Covert, Richard Dent, Gary Fensick. Men older, with more gray hair, but still the men who had stood with Steve on the Superdome field 40 years earlier, and they were here now, in the bedroom in Homer Glen, because there are things more important than geographic distance and schedules and convenience. Richard Dent sat by the bed, not speaking to the camera, not speaking to the Canton audience watching via live stream, only speaking to Steve, to the eyes looking at him and understanding every word even though they could not respond with any words. Steve, you are here with all your champion brothers. In Canton, there are 378 brothers waiting for you. You have joined a team that never cuts you, never fires you. Welcome home, Steve. Welcome home. Sister Kathy read the words Steve could no longer stand up and say for himself. Words written when he could still communicate enough to express his wishes, saved for this moment. I don't want ALS to be my legacy. What I did on the field, that is my legacy. Pushing myself to the limit, beyond what anyone else could. And while those words were being read, while teammates sat around the bed with eyes unable to hide emotion, while Misty held her husband's hand and Macy stood beside her mother, Steve McMichael could not say anything, could not stand up and shake Dent's hand, could not hug Singletary, could not do any of the things that on the nights he still dreamed about this Hall of Fame moment he had imagined he would do. There was no booming laughter, no stories told, no Mongo dominating the room in the way he had dominated every room throughout his life. Only him lying there, in the gold jacket, in the silence of a body no longer obeying, with eyes still bright and still seeing and still understanding everything happening around him. And perhaps exactly that motionless silence in the gold jacket was the most tragic and beautiful and truest moment of this entire long story. The moment that needed no words, no movement, no anything except presence. Steve McMichael was still the biggest man in the room. The man who played 191 games without missing a single one could not be present in Canton. The man who once threw a chair through the chalkboard out of excitement before the Super Bowl lay motionless in the gold jacket. The man who once made the whole of America listen could no longer speak. But in those eyes still bright, still recognizing everyone in the room, still understanding every word from Dent and every word Kathy read for him, was everything Steve McMichael still was and had never stopped being. And that was enough. More than enough. Enough to make the whole room, the men who had stood on the Superdome field and not cried, the men built not to cry, unable to hold it back anymore. Those weeks after the Hall of Fame came to Homer Glen, weeks that Misty would later never recount in chronological order because time in that period did not flow in order, Steve McMichael's body seemed to understand that the final task had been completed, as if everything that had been keeping him here, not medicine, not machines, but something with no name in any medical textbook, had been allowed to let go. The decline accelerated in a way that even Misty, who had learned to read every smallest change over the years, could not keep up with. What used to take months now took weeks. What used to take weeks now took days. Betsy Shepard came to visit in those days, the woman who had fought alongside Steve and Misty for the Hall of Fame for many years, who had made phone calls and written emails and advocated and refused to give up when others had given up, the woman Steve had once been able to speak to directly and now could only listen to. She sat by the bed, held his hand the way Misty usually did, and asked the question she asked every time she came, not because she expected an answer, but because that was how she told him she was still here, still listening, still cared. "Is there anything else you want me to do for you?" And Steve McMichael, with all the breath left in a body that had almost no breath of its own anymore, with all the final strength of a voice long lost and now existing only as a whisper that the person sitting beside him had to lean in to hear, whispered. Two words, just two words. Hall of Fame. Then silence, not the temporary silence of someone thinking or resting, but the silence of the last day a voice existed, and after that existed no more. Forever. Betsy sat with those two words in that silence, and later recounted. That was the last time he was able to speak to me. I asked if there was anything else he wanted me to do for him, and he said Hall of Fame. Thanks to the fans, we did it. I hope he knew that. People will hear that story and some will see sadness in it. That the final words were not, "I love you" to Misty, even though he loved her more than anything in the long life of a man who had loved many things. Not, "Dad loves you" to Macy, even though she was the reason he had blinked once when Misty asked about the DNR, the reason he had lived through the darkest months. Not, "Thank you" to Dent or Singletary or Hampton, or all the people who had come to Homer Glen to share the Hall of Fame day with him in the small bedroom instead of on the Canton stage. But those who truly understood Steve McMichael, understood the Freer kid, understood the man the Patriots called a criminal element, understood the man who played 191 games without missing a single one, because nothing was more important than showing up. They understood that those two words were not a shortfall. They were a spiritual will. The way he told the world one last time what he had said with his entire life. Do not remember me through ALS. Do not remember me through the hospital bed in Homer Glen. Do not remember me through the tubes and machines and silence. Remember me through what I did on the field. Remember me through the way I played. That is me. That is who I really am. In the final months after that, months with no voice, no whisper, no sound at all from Steve except the breathing machine, Macy still came into the room every day after school, sat by her father's bed, and told stories about school, about friends, about the small things in the life of a 17-year-old girl whose father could no longer ask questions or comment or laugh along. She told them not because she was sure her dad heard, not because there was proof he understood, but because it was the only thing she could do. And sometimes, in rare moments, her father's eyes would light up in the way she had learned to recognize as a smile, and that was enough for her to sit again the next day. And the day after that, Misty talked to Steve as usual, as if the 24 years had no gap in them, as if they were still sitting at dinner telling each other about their day. She told the small things, whether the Bears won or lost that week, what Macy did at school. The neighbor planted new trees in the yard, not because she thought Steve would answer, but because complete silence with the man who had been beside her through all of that hurt more than talking to herself, and because part of her still believed, still needed to believe, that he heard, that he was here, that the distance between where he was and where she stood was smaller than what the machines and silence showed. April of 2025. Steve stopped responding for 2 weeks. Misty knew, not because a doctor said it, not because there was a clear signal from the machines, but because 24 years beside Steve McMichael had taught her to read things that were never spoken and not measured by any device. She knew in the way of someone who had loved someone long enough to recognize when their presence began to fade. Not physically, the body was still there, still breathing with machines, still lying in the bed with the navy and orange sheets. But something else, something with no name in medicine, but people who have loved each other long enough all recognize. She moved Steve to Lightway's Hospice in Joliet, April 23rd, 2025. At 5:28 in the afternoon, Jarrett Payton, son of Walter Payton, who had walked alongside the McMichael family through all the ALS years, in a way no one asked him to, but he chose because that was how he understood loyalty, made the simple, straightforward announcement in the way Steve McMichael would have wanted if he could choose how the news about himself was spoken one last time. With deep sadness, I share that Steve McMichael passed away at 5:28 p.m. after a courageous battle with ALS, surrounded by his loved ones, Misty, Macy, the people who had been there through all the years no one photographed and no one wrote about. The years of the breathing machine and eyes as language, and the two whispered final words before the voice disappeared forever. Bears chairman George McCaskey wrote, "It is a cruel irony that the Bears Iron Man was brought down by this terrible disease." That sentence was true, but it was also not entirely true, because Steve McMichael did not surrender. He left after he had done everything he could do, after he had fought in the only way he knew how to fight, after he had received the Hall of Fame in the gold jacket, and left two final words as guidance for those remaining on how to remember him. Chicago lost something no city could replace. Not because Steve McMichael was an NFL legend, not because he was part of the greatest defense in history, but because he was a real man with all his pain and glory and booming laughter. And the nights sitting alone in front of his locker after losses and the eyes lighting up when he heard the name Hall of Fame. And Chicago, the city that knew how to love people like Steve McMichael in a way few other cities do, felt that absence in a specific, real, and irreplaceable way. Steve McMichael's final two words were not a goodbye. They were a declaration that a man could have everything taken by ALS, one piece at a time, in a cruel and patient order, until only breath remained, and even that breath needed machines to exist. But it could not take away what he had given. It could not take away 191 games. It could not take away Super Bowl 20 and the Superdome night and the championship ring on the hand of the kid once called Garbage Man in Freer, Texas. It could not take away the Hall of Fame, the honor he had blinked once to live long enough to receive, the honor his final two words reminded the world was the most important thing. And no disease, no fate could erase the way he had lived, from Freer to Chicago to Homer Glen, and the way he had died with his dignity intact, with the gold jacket on, with the people he loved beside him, with two final words that were not apology or goodbye, but a reminder to the world of what truly mattered. But Steve McMichael's story did not end at Lightway's Hospice at 5:28 p.m. on April 23rd, 2025. There was one more chapter, a chapter that Steve himself had decided to write before he left. Decided in the silence of the final months, when there was no voice left but there was still awareness, still thought, still the man who never did anything halfway. Before he passed, Steve McMichael decided to donate his brain to the Concussion and CTE Foundation. No one knows exactly the moment that decision was made. No clear date, no recorded conversation, only that at some point in the final years, when Steve could still communicate enough to express his wishes, he told Misty what he wanted to happen after he was gone. Not a funeral, not legacy or assets or anything belonging to the material world, but his brain. The brain that had thought and decided and remembered and felt through all those years, the brain that had been damaged in ways he did not know until it was too late. He wanted it to be used for something meaningful rather than simply leaving with him. This was not a simple decision. This was the decision of a man who knew he was dying and chose, among all the things he could choose in that moment, to make his death something more than just a death, to leave something others could use, to choose one final time to hold nothing back for himself. In April of 2026, nearly a year after Steve passed, Boston University announced the results of the study on his brain. Stage 3 out of 4 CTE. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The degenerative brain disease accumulated over many years of repeated impacts, only diagnosable accurately after death, only clearly visible when opened and examined. Stage 3 is a severe stage, not the final one, but enough for researchers to clearly see what had happened in that brain over decades and 191 Sundays of impacts. Eplong with TDP-43, the protein characteristic of ALS, in the brainstem and spinal cord. Two diseases, one brain. The man who could never be knocked down on the NFL grass had been knocked down from the inside, slowly, over decades, by the very sport he loved more than almost anything else in his life. Misty spoke out, not with the voice of someone angry, not with the voice of someone wanting revenge or accusation or destruction, but with the voice of someone who had sat beside her husband through 4 years of ALS and understood that anger would not change anything, but truth, spoken clearly, supported by scientific evidence, could change the future for those not yet damaged the way Steve had been. Too many NFL players develop ALS while alive and are diagnosed with CTE after death. I donated Steve's brain to advance research on the connection between them, so that players after him do not have to go through this. It was not the words of someone who wanted to destroy football, but the words of someone who wanted football to become better, safer, more worthy of what people like Steve McMichael had given to it. Because this is the truth that America, the country that loves football in a way no other sport is loved, must sit with and is not allowed to look away from. NFL players have a 4 times higher risk of ALS than normal people. Not twice, not 3 times, 4 times. And Dave Durson, Steve's teammate in the legendary Bears years, who stood beside him in the 46 defense, who shared those Chicago winters and big wins and all the things that created the collective memory of a generation of Bears, was also diagnosed with CTE after he ended his own life in 2011, after he asked his family to shoot him in the chest instead of the head so his brain could be studied. 2 men, the same team, the same defense called the greatest in history, the same ending, written by the things accumulated in the brain over the years they played football, the way America paid to watch and cheered to encourage. This raises the question no one in NFL meeting rooms or in sports broadcasts or in bar conversations before games wants to ask out loud, because asking out loud means having to hear the answer, and the answer is more complicated than any question. America loves football. America loves the tackles and the legendary defenses and the Iron Men who play 191 games without missing a single one. America loves Mongo. But is America willing to look straight at the real price of that love, the price not paid right on the field, not paid in the form of visible and treatable and recoverable injuries, but paid many decades later in small rooms with breathing machines and DNR papers and 2 whispered final words? And this is the most important thing to say. The thing Steve McMichael's story demands be said clearly. Steve McMichael never blamed football. Not once. Not one sentence. Not one moment in 4 years of ALS. When he could still speak, then when he could only whisper, then when only eyes remained, did he say or indicate anything that showed bitterness toward the NFL or toward football or toward the Sundays that had created him and were also taking him away at the same time? He loved that sport, loved it in the way of the freer kid who had found in football the only thing that allowed him to be completely himself, loved it in the way of the man who had given 13 years to one franchise and regretted not a single day. And therefore, his decision to donate his brain was not an accusation. It was not the action of someone who wanted to destroy what he loved, but a gift, the kind of gift that can only be given by someone who loved deeply enough to want what he loved to become better, safer, more worthy for those who would continue to give to it after he was no longer here, so that players after him would have the chance to understand the risks he did not have the chance to understand, so that science would have one more brain, a specific brain, with a name, with a history, with 191 recorded Sundays, to study and understand and find ways to protect those who would come after. Steve McMichael gave everything to football: his body, his health, the best years of his life, and finally his brain. Not because he was forced, not because he had no choice, but because that was how he loved this sport. Completely, unconditionally, holding nothing back for himself when there was something more important to give. And that final action, the decision made in the silence of the final days, carried out by Misty after he passed, was the way Steve McMichael continued to love football even when he was no longer here, by protecting the players after him from what he had to endure, by turning his death into something others could live from, live better, live longer, live with more information about what was really happening inside the brains of those playing the sport America loved more than anything else. And so we stand here, at the end of a long story from Freer, Texas, to the Superdome in New Orleans, to the small house in Homer Glen, Illinois, and ask ourselves the question every real story ends with: what remains? ALS took Steve McMichael's voice, took his movement, took his physical strength, the thing that had defined him from the early mornings in Freer when he followed EV, collecting trash, and learned that the body was the only thing completely his, took the ability to hug Macy when she walked into the room after school, took the ability to tell Misty, "I love you," in a way that 24 years of marriage had not yet made those words redundant, took the ability to say thank you to Dent, to Singletary, to Hampton, to all the people who had chosen to stand beside him in ways he never asked for but they chose, took the ability to stand up by himself, the man who had stood up after every fall in his life, from Freer to the Patriots, to the divorce papers, to the ALS diagnosis. The final time could no longer stand up by himself. But there were things ALS could not take. Not because ALS was not cruel enough, but because those things were not among the things ALS could touch. 191 consecutive games without missing a single one. The number still stands in the Chicago Bears record books, still the number anyone who wants to understand Steve McMichael must start from. Super Bowl 20 and the Superdome night and that championship ring on the hand of the kid from Freer. Still true, still history, still something no disease or time can erase. The Hall of Fame, the honor he had blinked once to live long enough to receive, the honor his final two words reminded the world was the legacy he chose. The booming laughter in the Bears' locker room that Dan Hampton still hears in his memories every time he sits down and thinks about those years. Laughter no breathing machine could silence, no silence could erase. The single blink in the room in Homer Glen when Misty asked about the DNR. The smallest and greatest choice of a man who had run out of ways to fight in all the ways he knew, but still had one way: choose more time. The two final whispered words, the declaration of a man who never allowed anyone to define him by the way he left. Macy McMichael grew up carrying all of that, not as a burden, but as legacy in the truest sense of the word. She had beaten leukemia at 4 years old and grown up watching her father fight ILS in the most important years of her adolescence. No child should carry that weight, but Macy carried it in a way anyone looking could immediately recognize, without bowing her head, without complaint, without letting things that could not be changed define the things that could. In the way she carried that weight, people saw her father, the freer kid who had learned that life does not hand you dignity, you have to seize it inch by inch. Macy McMichael is the one who will continue to live what Steve McMichael had lived. And that is the kind of legacy no Hall of Fame plaque can record. And Misty. Steve McMichael's story is told often, on Chicago radio, in sports articles, in videos like this one, in all the places people gather to remember those who left a mark. But Misty's story, the woman not trained to do any of what she had to do, who learned to operate the breathing machine because there was no other choice, who saved her husband from death with her bare hands on the night the nurse accidentally unplugged the machine, who had to be strong every day in front of the strongest man she knew when that man could no longer be strong, who donated her husband's brain after he passed because that was what he wanted and she wanted to honor it, That story is told far less than it deserves to be heard. That is a story that also needs to be heard, not as a footnote to Steve's story, but as its own story about the woman who chose to love unconditionally and lived with everything that choice demanded. Looking at Steve McMichael's life, from Freer to the Superdome to Homer Glen, what do you see? A winner? He won more things than most people can imagine, but also lost the only thing no one can win. A victim? He never lived as a victim, not one day, not one moment, even on the darkest days. Or, perhaps closest to the truth, an ordinary man in the most beautiful sense of the word, a man with strength and weakness, glory and pain, who loved and lost and loved again, who fought not because he always believed he would win, but because he did not know how to do otherwise. Life took more from Steve McMichael than anyone should have to endure. The stepfather shot and killed before seeing his son become a champion. The first wife who left in a way with no sufficient explanation. An incurable disease that came for him at age 63. Voice, strength, independence, taken away one by one in a cruel and patient order. But there was one thing ALS could not touch, fate could not take, time could not fade. The way Steve McMichael fought. Not the outcome of the fight, but the way he fought. With dignity on the days he could. With will on the days when only will remained. With love for Misty and Macy and all the people who chose to stand beside him. And when he could no longer fight in any other way. With two final whispered words of a man who never gave up, even when there was nothing left not to give up for. Now, looking back at the Superdome photo from 1986, number 76 standing in the middle of the field, 73,000 fans cheering, the 46-10 victory just finished, and the whole country looking and seeing an invincible man. Look into the eyes in that photo, not to see victory, but to see everything standing behind that smile. The Freer kid called Garbage Man. The son who did not get to say thank you to his father before his father passed. The man who would sit alone in the nights after the stadium lights went out and wonder who Steve McMichael was when no one was looking. The man who would blink once in the room in Homer Glen. The man who would whisper two final words and then fall silent. Those eyes in the 1986 photo already knew all of that. In the way life always knows what is coming, even if the person living it cannot see it. They just had not happened yet. If this story touched you, remember this. There are thousands of other Steve McMichaels fighting ALS right now, in small rooms in small towns, with no Hall of Fame waiting for them and no cameras recording their fight. And there are thousands of other Misty McMichaels sitting beside them, learning to operate breathing machines with no one to teach them, stronger than anyone knows, lonelier than anyone sees, loving in a way no words are enough to describe. Steve McMichael's story has ended. Theirs has not. And if Steve McMichael's story teaches us anything, it is this. The stories that have not ended need to be heard more than the stories that have ended, because they can still be written differently. The man of steel, who was never knocked down on the grass field, finally knocked down by something invisible, untacklable, unfightable with strength, something that had accumulated in his brain through 191 Sundays of impacts that America paid to watch and cheered to encourage and called great. And in the way he fell, not suddenly on the field with the crowd roaring, but slowly and in silence, and in the small room with Misty beside him and Macy nearby, with dignity intact and love undiminished and two final whispered words, like the declaration of a man who knew who he was until the final breath. He taught us something 191 NFL games could not teach, something no stadium is big enough to contain, and no stat sheet is complete enough to record, that it is not winning that defines a man, but the way they stand firm when they know they cannot win, and the way they love when there is nothing left to do except love. Steve McMichael, number 76. From Freer, Texas to the Superdome in New Orleans to Homer Glen, Illinois. And forever in the memory of all those who once cheered his name, once wore the number 76 jersey, once sat through Chicago winters and believed that man could not be knocked down. He could not. It was just that what knocked him down did not come from the outside. If the story of Steve McMichael touched you in any way, please hit subscribe so you do not miss the next stories about people who lived fully, fought without stopping, and left behind something more precious than any championship ring. Thank you for staying until the end, and we will see you in the next story, where once again we will look behind the stage lights and find the truth no one told you.